Welcome everyone to our presentation on the retrospective of the Data Curation Network. I'm Jake Carlson. I'm the director of director of Deep Blue Repositories and Research Data Services at the University of Michigan. And I'll kick it over to Lisa to introduce herself.
And hi everyone. My name is Lisa Johnston. I'm the director of data governance at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mikala?
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Mikala Narlock. I am the director of the Data Curation Network based at the University of Minnesota.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We're really thrilled to have you and to talk a bit about our history with the Data Curation Network. I do want to note before we get started that we are recording this presentation and that we'll also be sharing the slides on the Data Curation Network website. We have a number of links embedded in the slides, and so they'll be available then on the website when we post it. So let's go ahead and get started. Mikala, could you advance the slide? Yeah, thanks. So I'm here to talk about the early days, the days that sort of led us to thinking about what a data curation network might look like and how to put it forward. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Hey, so who here remembers 2010? There was a lot of interesting things going on then. The Twilight movies were in theaters. Who could forget that? Lady Gaga wore her meat dress to the MTV Video Music Awards, which frankly I regret seeing. but 2010, wacky times. And then we were all playing Angry Birds on our iPhones. That was the new latest game craze. Exciting stuff back in the day. It was also a time when the NSF released their data management plan requirement, where they said that any grant submission to the NSF had to include a supplementary document of 2 pages that described the data that would be produced over the course of the project, that talked a bit about how the data would be described and formatted for use by others, that included information about how the data would be made accessible to others outside of the research project itself, and that included some information about what people could do with that data once they had it, and then some thoughts about how that data could be archived or preserved for the long term to ensure ongoing access. And this was a really exciting development for us in libraries. We really saw a lot of potential to really, I think, involve ourselves in the research process in new ways. We have skills that really relate to description and organization and making content available. So data, I think, was a way to expand our skill sets and expand our involvement into the research process. And this caused a lot of confusion for researchers. I mean, I think we've been dealing with this more recently with the NIH and their big push, but similar kinds of things happened with the NSF. Researchers were like, oh, we didn't necessarily see this coming. We don't know how to do that. It's not clear as to what's expected of us. So we really need help in figuring out how do we respond to this new kind of requirement. And libraries, I think, really stepped up in anticipation of being able to help. Go ahead and put the next slide on. Yeah, thanks. So I think we realized pretty quickly that researchers needed help with their data management plans. And I think the old saying back in the day was, this is the announcement that launched 1,000 LibGuides. So Purdue, where I was at the time, along with a number of other libraries, put together advice or guidance on how to handle and respond to the data management plan requirement itself. But I think we recognized pretty quickly that it wasn't a matter of addressing just the data management plan and getting the grant through the door and hopefully accepted, but what were researchers committing to, or what should they be committing to in terms of making their data more widely available? That the data management plan really was just the beginning of a longer process looking at how can we make not just the data available, but useful for other people as an information object of importance going forward. Next slide, please. And so one of the first things that we did was to try to figure out, what are researchers doing, right? What is sort of the current state of how they work with their data and how they understand the management and potentially sharing it. And so again, back when I was at Purdue, one of the things that I was involved in early on in my career was creating something called the Data Curation Profiles Toolkit. And really what we tried to do is to take advantage of the skill sets that librarians have in conducting reference interviews. I often refer to this as a reference interview on steroids. And the purpose here was to get information about a particular data set that the researcher was working on that they would need to share in some way, shape, or form at the end of the project due to requirements from the federal funding agencies, or because they really wanted to and they saw value in sharing that data set. But learning about that data set, what was it comprised of? How many files were a part of this? What format was it in? How was it being described or documented? Those current practices in managing and working with that data set were really important as well, just to get sort of sort of a baseline understanding of what researchers were already doing that would help advance this particular initiative. And then perhaps more importantly, go back for a minute. Perhaps more importantly, what were the unmet needs of the researchers? So what did they want to do with their data set, but they weren't doing for whatever reason? And that may be, sharing the data set more broadly. Perhaps they didn't know how to do that or weren't sure how to prepare their data set for sharing. Really trying to identify where could the library step in and provide services of value, and really understanding this from the researcher perspective as to what would be helpful for them in helping them accomplish their goals and having the kind of impact that they want to have with their data set. Next slide, please. Another early effort in the 2010s or so by Cornell University was forming their research data management group. And this was a group, I think the Cornell libraries really realized early on that this is going to take more than just library skills and expertise to make happen. Really managing research data effectively and sharing it effectively involves IT, involves the Office of Research, could potentially involve the IRB, and therefore, rather than trying to solve or address the data sharing issues or challenges just in the library or just in IT wasn't going to make it an effective output. We really needed to come together with agencies across the university to bring our collective skills and knowledge and expertise together to figure out how we can best support researchers in doing this particular work. And Cornell, I think, still stands as a model, at least it has at the University of Michigan, for how we can do this work and do it effectively. I think some of the early triumphs of Cornell was the work put together to develop a model README file of the kinds of things that should or could be in README files to make the data more effective. And it also, I think, looking at some early research with data management plans and researchers' ability to sort of understand what was being asked of them and really to identify places where they seem to be getting stuck with the whole concept of the data management plan and what we could do to try to address that. And then more recently, they've released something called the Data Storage Finder tool, which helps researchers identify the different types of storage available on campus to them and make decisions based on their needs as to what type of storage might be effective. And they released that in open source. The code behind it is open source, and we've adopted that at Michigan, and I know a number of other universities have adopted that as well. So still very influential for this work going forward with research data management services. Next slide, please. So something else that happened fairly soon after the announcement from the NSF came to pass, ARL and DLF came together to put together what they call the eScience Institute. This is back in the day when data science was more referred to by different terms, and eScience was one of those early ones. And I think the ARL and DLF recognized that this was going to be a grand challenge for libraries. We had relevant skill sets and abilities here, but we hadn't applied them to data before. This is a new application for us, and we needed to do some work and some thinking about how we could prepare ourselves as an institution, as a library, to go forward. And I think really one of the big advantages from my sense of the eScience Institute is that rather than having each institution try to do this individually and struggle through it on their own, we brought together cohorts of institutions to work on these things and discuss them in tandem. Even though the outcome was meant to be a strategic agenda for the institution, talking things through, identifying patterns, seeing commonalities, and addressing collectively our strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, the SWOT analysis, was really useful in informing what we might do individually through the logic and knowledge of our peer sets. And so we had 70 institutions sign up for the first iteration of the eScience Institute, and this was pretty much sight unseen, right? We hadn't, I was one of the instructors in the eScience Institute, and we hadn't really come together to figure out what exactly we were going to do when we made the announcement. And the fact that we got such an overwhelming response of people really interested in this space and really wanting to be engaged in how we can move things forward, I think spoke to the importance of this to the library field. And so I think this is another place where we really saw an opportunity to come together and to work collaboratively to figure out how we might address these particular questions that come up with offering data management and data sharing services. Next slide, please. So one of the other things that happened a lot around the 2010s and the early days was the use of repositories as a means to enable data to be shared in ways that federal funding agencies and others were really hoping or intending would happen. And some libraries, such as the University of Minnesota, went as far as to create a separate, distinct, standalone data repository for that particular purpose. But with the creation of this infrastructure, we really wanted to have it used in particular ways. We didn't want to see it as a dumping ground for data, for people to just check a box and say, okay, well, I've done it, I'm done. We wanted this to be a useful service, not just for producers of data sets, but for people consuming those data sets, right? That the handoff is not just here's a bunch of files that comprise a data set, but here's a data set that can be understood, can be trusted, can be reused by consumers. And all of that requires more than just sort of opening up the repository box and having people put stuff into it. It requires some thought and some actions with regards to what we might do with that data set. How might we review that data set to improve its value, to make it the best data set that it can be for being understood, trusted, and reused by other people who would want to have an interest in it or make use of it in some way, shape, or form. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think that Lisa really did, and I'm really impressed by, is she identified early on that we would need to curate that data. We would need to review it and to augment it in ways that would increase its value. And so she did a lot of really good work in identifying, well, what is the current state of knowledge around data curation? What is curating data really? What are its actions? What kinds of thoughts and expertise go into curating data? And how can we not just understand that concept, but apply it in practical, actionable ways in our work as librarians? So if we are offering a repository, what are the kinds of things that we need to do to review and to check and to augment that data to really make it the best data set that it can be? So she's published 2 books with regards to curating research data, both on what it is, as well as strategies for applying it to the repository. But then she went a step further and did an experiment with librarians at the University of Minnesota, essentially giving them data sets and saying, okay, in looking at this, given your skills, given your knowledge, given your backgrounds in librarianship, what might you do to make this a data set that could be more useful to others? What kinds of things could we apply to it? And from that early experiment, we got a sense as to what kind of work might be involved in curating data, as well as the time and the labor involved in doing this kind of work, in making it more of a normative practice. And I think that was really invaluable in terms of the work that we've done later on in the Data Curation Network. Next slide, please. So in summary, the early days presented us with a lot of challenges. We saw immediately that we had skills and expertise for preserving and sharing. We've done this with different types of content, but that easily translating our work from more traditional forms of content to data wasn't sort of an automatic one-to-one match. We had to better understand the nature of research data and the nature of researchers' needs for research data as well to really be effective in this kind of work. And really figure out not just what was needed, but how could we do it as an operational practice in libraries, that being really, really important. And then we also realized that there was a lot of work happening in this space, but we didn't want to have it just being done in isolation in institutions. This is enough of a sea change for us that in order to really be effective and to go farther, we needed to work together and to figure out how we could cooperate and share information so that we could all do a better job in this particular space and develop services that were applicable and valued by researchers across the country, if not the world. And so thinking about how do we work together and break down those barriers that typically exist across institutions? How could we work more closely together as peers in learning more about this and in making it happen? And what kinds of common practices or infrastructure might be valuable for us in doing this work and in helping everybody being able to tackle this work effectively? Next slide, please. Okay, and now I'm going to turn this over to Lisa to talk about the early days of the Data Curation Network.
Great. Thank you so much, Jake. And I think you definitely illustrated the fact that we were really well positioned with all the foundational stuff that was happening to kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and take this next step to collectively work on data curation issues. So we took on kind of an ambitious project. And if you want to jump to the next slide. So we went after a grant to try to form a network that would really build the foundation for sharing data curation expertise across institutions. This was funded by the Alpha P. Sloan Foundation, and we started off with that idea that later we were able to term as radical interdependence. So we weren't just talking to each other or sharing information about what I do versus what you do. We did that also, but the main goal was to really share the workload, to be able to trust in the staff at another institution who might have expertise in a particular data type that your institution doesn't have, to be able to really help do the work of curation to ensure, as Jake mentioned, that we are putting the data in the most useful formats possible into our long-term repositories. So the key areas that we really started out to address was to build that workflow that would allow us to share curation expertise across a number of institutions. Define a governance model for how we would really build up that network and grow. We actually crafted a 6-year implementation plan that would really allow us to grow very slowly, very cautiously, to understand kind of where our interests in our members lie. We cared a lot about what our curators thought about all of this work and the sharing part, and really building up that community slowly. We also wanted to build a financial sustainability plan and put that into practice, which we were able to do. And then finally, was this work worth it? What is the value of curation? How can we really understand the impact of the work that we're doing? And we took on a number of research projects to do that. So the timeline for all of this work was about 6 years. That is that 6-year implementation plan that we were able to do. We started out with 6 partners, and by the end we had 15 with that steady growth pattern. We were able to launch a fully functional data curation network with staffing. We hired a full-time staff coordinator to really train our data curators in a shared workflow, which I'll talk about, as well as really create the technology solution for managing the shared curation workflow as well. And then as we moved into the sustaining mode, really to engage with the membership and really be able to really support our members and build up that community, which we understood was so important and desired. And then we were able to grow from there. And for that, I'll turn it over to our DCN director, Mikala.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I'm just so honored to be a part of one small part of this big project. And so in the past about year and a half that I've been with the DCN, we've now grown up to 19 member institutions with 2 new universities joining us in fiscal year 2023, the University of Wisconsin and the University of Pennsylvania. So now that the DCN's been in operation for about 7 years, you might be wondering, where's the DCN now? And so just in case you're not familiar, here's a quick overview of who we are. We are a community-led network of curators who advance open research by making data more ethical, reusable, and understandable. We're an active community of data stewards and curation practitioners who we share our knowledge and our time to collaboratively curate research outputs through that mechanism Lisa mentioned earlier, and really advance the data curation profession as a network. We do a lot, and so some of the things that we do are listed here, but it includes curation from our 17 partner institutions, soon to be 19. We have nearly 50 individual curation experts who are the foundation of this cross-institutional curation workflow, who have a wide variety of expertise in data formats and disciplines. And one thing I particularly love about the DCN is that even when we get some new obscure format or some discipline we don't see often, there's always someone who volunteers to curate it because it's a learning experience for them and they get to, get their hands dirty with this new kind of data. I digress. Something else that we provide are education resources. So we have a 2-day workshop, which I believe Lisa will talk about more in a moment, as well as data curation primers, as well as a very active community of practice that offers interest groups, professional development opportunities, and networking and research. Again, we'll talk about this more later, but research is really at the heart of the DCN. So Jake kind of set the background of where we were in the 2010s, and Lisa talked a little more about the development of the DCN. And we decided in March 2022 to conduct a project retrospective that brought together many of the project personnel to better understand these processes of planning and implementing the DCN, understanding the context of the time, where we're at now, and where we're heading. So we were at a very interesting point in time. We'd transitioned to be member funded. We'd launched that governance model and the membership model. I had recently been hired about 3 months prior to the retrospective, and Lisa Johnston was preparing to transition to a new position outside of the DCN, but you can see we didn't let her go. But anyways, we hosted this project retrospective to really understand what were the successes and challenges that we faced in building, launching, and sustaining the DCN? Where are we headed for this next phase of our work? And how can we ensure that this transition in personnel is as smooth as possible? So Lisa and I collaborated to create a retrospective meeting agenda that over the course of 2.5 days set out to answer those questions. Again, as a team though, not just 1 or 2 perspectives. And we think that this was a successful endeavor, and we wanted to just quickly share how we organized this meeting. We balanced structured and unstructured conversations. So sometimes we would have very specific questions and prompts, and other times we would have a really broad topic and kind of let the discussion just go wherever it went. But we also brought in different activities and prompts to make sure that we were engaging all of the personnel and mechanisms that they were most comfortable with. Not everyone was comfortable necessarily, using a Jamboard or in the discussion, but we tried to make sure that through different activities, everybody could have their voice represented. And we incorporated and balanced both celebrating the accomplishments of our community while acknowledging the challenges and shortcomings and where we wanted to go. So we captured all of those discussions through a lot of notes, and as a team, we authored a retrospective report published through the University of Michigan Press in March 2023. You can access it at this DOI, and you can see there is a long list of co-authors who made this possible, so thank you all. And at that, I will now turn it back to Lisa.
Yeah, so we were just going to share some of the key findings from the report with you today, just to give you a flavor of what this retrospective process really helped us uncover as a project. So the first thing we were able to do is, the fun thing we were able to do was kind of really reflect on some of our successes. What did we feel proud of that we were able to accomplish throughout the history of the project? And what was interesting is that as we were coming up with these various different successes, we realized that they were not all of the same type of success. They actually came in different flavors, and we were able to kind of recognize and name those flavors, which helped us better understand really the types of structures that need to be in place to make a cross-institutional project like ours successful. So as you can see here, some of these successes were actually administrative things that were really put into place maybe at the beginning that really helped organize a large group of people that were mostly volunteer-based and were really needing kind of some of those extra components to come together and to do things like research-informed practice or to do targeted engagement. We also recognize a number of tool-based structures, things that either we were building ourselves, like the data curation primers, or things that were really assisting in making our project more successful. And then finally, I think the most important recognition and a word that came up over and over and over again in our retrospective discussion was this idea of trust. And our trust-based structures that were less tangible than those other entities, but were actually so core and so critical. I really think back to some of the early work we did in just introducing ourselves to one another and learning each other's expertise in data curation. And then really building upon that expertise by having profiles of each of our curators. We publish them almost on a monthly basis, where you can really get to know the different curators in our group and understand, why they might be a trusted expert in curating, databases or curating crystallography files. It's because of their experience, it's because of their training, it's because of all of that background that's coming, with them. And so that trust building piece has been so critical and really aided in our understanding of kind of how we've grown and how we need to grow in the future to preserve that. So just a few examples of some of the successes. The first example here is that research informed practice. We really based a lot of the structure of the curation work that we do on actual needs that our researchers have. So research data management librarians have been working alongside researchers to implement data management plans. So we really knew who to go to talk to and ask questions about, well, okay, what actually do you need help with in terms of curating our data, in terms of making our data available? So if you want to click one more time, I've got a picture of some of the results. We did focus groups. We went to 6 different universities. We sat down with researchers and we talked to them about, what are the most important pieces of curation work do you value? And we also, after asking some of those questions, which ones are you receiving and which ones are you not receiving? Or which ones are you able to do yourself and which ones do you need help with? Or do you want students in your lab to get training on? So we really listened to what the researchers were identifying as kind of their most important needs. If you click again, the next piece here we looked at is one more slide or there. The next group we turn to is the institutions themselves that were offering curation services and what were their challenges. Where were they providing services? Where were they not providing services? And maybe what was the gap between services that they really weren't able to provide due to staffing, due to expertise, versus what researchers really needed? So we really tried to pay attention early on to understand where that gap is and how we could best fill it. If we go to the next slide, another example of one of the successes was our data curation service model. And in this, we really took a good opportunity to consider what is that local institutional need? What are their priorities? And how can we build a curation workflow that does not compete with any local institutional priorities? And so we created a process where the data curation network could be interjected into an existing repository environment, into an existing repository staffing plan that wouldn't disrupt that wouldn't get in the way or even really directly interact with the researcher, because we understood that was a huge priority for local institutions, is to have that direct interaction. We really built it so that it could be just a piece that could be added in addition. It's the human layer of your technology stack, we called it. And so the curation service model itself, if you click one more time, also allowed us to standardize the practices across all of our data curators. And this was also built on research around what were the typical actions that we would need to take, and maybe even the minimum actions, because certainly there are more that we would need to take to ensure that the data that we are ingesting, appraising, and selecting for our repositories would ultimately be useful. And so these two elements, and then the practice of implementing these elements and then tracking how well our curators were going through each of these elements and what they were finding when they hit, the augment step or the transform step, like what were their decision points, really gave us a very valuable base to grow from. And then the final success that I just wanted to highlight for the group here was taking everything that we learned by evaluating our different workflows across our member institutions, by standardizing a workflow and creating a training program for curators. We then implemented that for the broader community. So we received funding from the IMLS and we're able to expand that training and teach that training, which was a 2-day course at first, but we also transitioned it to an online GitHub. Thank you. The online modules are available for anyone to use, open access, and take that training so that we could expand this information to anyone who might be interested or anyone who might be struggling at their institution to handle all of these needs. And from that, our attendees at these workshops also were able to contribute back to the community. We set up an environment where they would do a capstone. So after attending one of our workshops, a 2-day workshop in person or a virtual workshop, they can get into groups. We had groups of 4 to 5 that would then work for about a 6-month period to research a particular data format and develop what we called a data curation primer that would really explain how you might approach curating this particular data type, whether it's a Jupyter notebook or an STL file. And this product, and they're all available on our website, has really been a welcome resource, I think, to the community to really jumpstart that curation process and to really get you thinking about what do I actually need to do when I encounter this type of format. So these were the initial primers that we published from the 3 first workshops that we held, and they have been growing. I think if you click one more time, Mikala, we just published in May a number of new primers, coming out from the community, authored by a wide range of individuals, not just DCN members, and that's just been a really exciting development to see continuing. I think I'll turn it over to you, Mikala.
That sounds great. All right, thanks all. We're nearing the end here. So as Lisa shared, we've accomplished some amazing things over the years, but this is not to suggest that there haven't been challenges in developing, launching, and sustaining the DCN. And in fact, there remains work to be done. We are in the ongoing development phase of the life cycle that you can see highlighted here from the Community Cultivation Field Guide from Educopia. And in this phase, it requires a continued focus on fostering our healthy community, demonstrating our sustainability, and ensuring that we're growing to meet the changing needs of our community. So as we know, data curation is constantly evolving, and so our community will continue to grow and take new iterations. And I feel like I can speak for all of us when I say we're in a very fortunate position to be financially stable and to have a really active and engaged community that will help us address some of the challenges on the horizon. So one of the challenges that we see, both current and future, is the homogeneity of our members. We are primarily R1s and we are all well-resourced institutions. And while this makes sense to a degree, these are the institutions that have the resources to not only have a curation service, but also to join the network. We also want to be sure that the DCN is seen and understood as welcoming and is welcoming to all institutions, regardless of their type. So we are here to support curators looking for a community. It doesn't matter if you're from an R1 or something like that. So in the coming years, we will continue to find ways to serve as a welcoming and inclusive community for all data curators. And as a quick reminder / plug, your institution does not have to be a sustaining member to participate in the DCN. Another challenge in the coming years that we will continue to do to grapple with is to balance our interests, our goals, and our research agenda with the very real and limited capacity. I am very fortunate to be a full-time staff member on the DCN, but I am the only full-time staff member and the only staff member. Everyone else participates on top of their day jobs. And so while there are many exciting opportunities and interests that we have, we also have to be sure that we are moving strategically so as not to burn ourselves out. And lastly, as we grow, we've been reflecting on that radical interdependence that Lisa brought up. It's the fabric of the DCN, and we know that the trust between members and this community is really one of the key benefits of joining the DCN. And so as we onboard new members and new institutions, we really have to continue to be thoughtful and intentional about how we build and maintain trust and community and connection between our curators. Looking more broadly at the data curation profession, there are some, data librarian profession, there are some really exciting challenges and opportunities on the horizon and happening now. I'm just going to talk about a couple, but there are plenty more that we could talk about. First is supporting data communities. Recently, the DCN collaborated with Ithaca S&R on an NSF-funded project to better understand the data management sharing needs of data communities. Data communities are defined as formal or informal groups of scholars who share a certain type of data with each other, regardless of disciplinary or institutional boundaries. And one of the results of this workshop, it demonstrates that there's a lot of room for librarians to connect with these communities and support them throughout their research data life cycles. Another interesting and challenging opportunity is collaboration across IRs with specific regards to metadata application. Recent work through the NSF-funded Realities of Academic Data Sharing initiative based at the Association of Research Libraries has shown some real shocking, in my opinion, insights into the metadata completeness in participating IRs. We've learned that many institutions are applying metadata in slightly different ways. Think of things like keywords or subjects. They might be applied just with minor nuances that is enough to make it hard to compare apples to apples. And by the time that this data from our institutional repositories makes it up to something like DataCite, like an aggregator, we're finding that the completeness of the records can vary pretty wildly. And so this is another area where I think it will be really important as we continue to aggregate records and demonstrate our impact, that we kind of all come together on solving this shared challenge. And lastly, when thinking about data or characteristics of data repositories, you may be familiar with this desirable characteristics of data repositories for federally funded research. I think that many institutional repositories are wondering, how can we demonstrate alignment with some of these characteristics? How can we make sure that it's clear that for our researchers who are funded by federal funding agencies, that they can share their data in our repositories when it's appropriate, when there's not a domain repository already available for them? And we are actually embarking on some exciting work on this very summer. So I'll drop the link in the chat after the presentation. You can sign up to join our first virtual learning series on this topic. And with that, to wrap up this long, strange journey, some of our key takeaways are that successful cross-institutional collaboration requires trust and vulnerability, but also resources. We should not discount the ability to focus time and energy and money on a project in order to see it be successful. We also think it's important to emphasize the retrospective process can provide a structured reflection time to celebrate successes and prioritize for the future. And one that didn't make it on the slide, but I'd like to reiterate, is that many of us are facing similar challenges, and we don't need to go through those challenges alone. And with that, we thank you sincerely for your time and would love to open the floor for questions and comments.